The day started like any other at the busy airport. People were rushing around, dragging suitcases and checking their watches as they lined up for security. Among them was a young man, barely 17, traveling alone for the first time. He had saved up for months to visit his grandmother in another state, and this trip meant the world to him. With his headphones on and a small backpack slung over one shoulder, he looked like any other teenager trying to blend into the crowd. After passing through security without a hitch, he made his way to the gate. His heart raced with excitement, but also a little nervousness. Flying by himself was new territory for him, and he wanted everything to go smoothly. As boarding began, he stepped onto the plane, clutching his ticket tightly. He found his assigned seat near the window, stowed his bag under the seat in front of him and settled in, gazing out at the tarmac below. Everything seemed normal at first. The cabin filled up slowly, and the usual hum of chatter filled the air. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, helping passengers find seats and stow luggage. But then something happened that would change the course of his day, and maybe even his life. One of the flight attendants, a woman who looked stressed and slightly impatient, approached his row. She glanced at him briefly before continuing her routine checks. A few moments later, she returned, her expression sharper this time. Her eyes locked onto him, and her tone carried an edge that immediately put him on guard. "Sir," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "you need to turn off your phone right now. We've already gone over the safety instructions." The young man froze, unsure of what to say. He hadn't been using his phone. It was tucked safely in his pocket, switched off just as instructed earlier. Confused, he looked up at her and tried to explain. "Ma'am, I don't have my phone out," he said softly, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. But instead of listening, the flight attendant cut him off. "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her tone sharp and dismissive. Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing at the scene unfolding while others avoided looking altogether. It felt like everyone was watching, waiting to see how this awkward moment would play out. The young man felt heat rise to his cheeks. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially when he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. Still, he tried again to clarify. "I promise I turned it off before we boarded," he said, keeping his voice calm but firm. This time, the flight attendant didn't respond verbally. Instead, she held out her hand, demanding to see the device herself. Reluctantly, he pulled his phone from his pocket and handed it over. She examined it quickly, confirming that it was indeed powered off, but her demeanor didn't soften. If anything, she seemed more irritated, as if his compliance somehow annoyed her further. "You should have known better than to ignore the rules," she muttered under her breath before walking away. The young man sat there, stunned. He replayed the interaction in his mind, trying to figure out where things had gone so wrong. Why had she singled him out? Was it because of how he looked? These questions swirled in his head as the plane prepared for takeoff. As the engines roared to life, he stared out the window, feeling a mix of emotions: embarrassment, anger, and frustration. He thought about calling his mom, who always told him to stay calm in tough situations. But then he remembered something else. His uncle, a lawyer known for fighting against unfair treatment, had given him his number before the trip. "Call me if you ever need help," his uncle had said. At the time, the young man hadn't thought much of it. Now those words echoed in his mind. With trembling fingers, he opened a messaging app and typed out a quick note to his uncle. He explained what had happened, careful to include every detail. Then he hit send, not knowing that this single action would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Little did he know, his decision to reach out for help would soon bring the entire flight to a halt and shine a spotlight on issues far bigger than himself. The young man sat in his seat, staring at the screen of his phone as he waited for a reply. His mind was racing with thoughts about what had just happened. He replayed the flight attendant's sharp tone and dismissive attitude over and over again. It wasn't just that she accused him of breaking the rules. It was the way she treated him like he was guilty before he even had a chance to explain himself. The weight of it all pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. A few moments later, his phone buzzed. It was his uncle. The message was short, but reassuring. "Stay calm. Let me handle this." Those words alone brought some relief, but the young man couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than one embarrassing moment on a plane. This was about being treated unfairly because of how he looked. And if he let it slide, who's to say it wouldn't happen again, to him or someone else? He typed back quickly, explaining that he didn't want to make a scene, but he also didn't think it was right to stay silent. His uncle replied almost instantly, saying, "You're not making a scene. You're standing up for yourself. That's important. Trust me, I'll take care of the rest." With those words echoing in his mind, the young man leaned back in his seat, trying to steady his nerves. Outside, the plane began taxiing toward the runway. The hum of the engines grew louder and the cabin vibrated slightly as they picked up speed. But despite the motion around him, his thoughts were stuck on what might come next. Would his uncle really be able to do anything? Or would this whole thing blow over without anyone caring? Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the passengers on board, the young man's uncle sprang into action. First, he called the airline's corporate office, asking to speak with someone in charge. When a representative finally came on the line, the uncle wasted no time getting straight to the point. He described the incident in detail, emphasizing how his nephew had been singled out and treated disrespectfully by a member of the crew. The representative tried to brush it off at first, suggesting it was likely a simple misunderstanding. But the uncle wasn't having it. "This isn't just a misunderstanding," he said firmly. "My nephew followed the rules, yet he was humiliated in front of everyone. That's not okay. If you don't address this properly, we'll have no choice but to escalate things further." To drive his point home, the uncle mentioned that he was a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, but someone who specialized in cases involving discrimination. He warned them that failing to act responsibly could lead to legal consequences. More importantly, he hinted at going public with the story, knowing full well that such incidents often sparked outrage when brought to light. When the airline still seemed hesitant to take immediate action, the uncle decided to raise the stakes even higher. He reached out to a journalist friend who covered social justice issues. Within minutes, tweets and posts about the incident started circulating online. People read the story of a teenager being mistreated on a flight and reacted strongly. Comments poured in from all sides, some expressing sympathy for the young man, others sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment while traveling. Hashtags like "Stand for Justice" and "Fair Treatment for All" began trending, drawing attention to the growing backlash against the airline. Social media users criticized the company for allowing its staff to treat passengers so poorly. Some even called for a boycott until proper measures were taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. Back on the plane, none of this was visible to the young man. All he knew was that something felt different. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, the intercom crackled to life. The pilot's voice broke through the cabin, announcing that there would be a short delay due to operational reasons. Passengers exchanged confused glances, wondering what could possibly be causing the holdup now. Some groaned in frustration, eager to get moving after already enduring the usual delays of air travel. For the young man, though, the announcement triggered a mix of emotions. Part of him wondered if his uncle's intervention had something to do with it. Could his message have actually made a difference? Or was this just another random hiccup in an already chaotic day? He glanced around the cabin, noticing curious eyes darting toward him. Whether intentional or not, people seemed to sense that he was somehow connected to whatever was happening. As the minutes ticked by, ground crew members suddenly boarded the plane. They walked briskly down the aisle, heading straight for the section where the flight attendant, the same one who had confronted him earlier, was stationed. Without explanation, they escorted her off the aircraft. The sight sent murmurs rippling through the cabin. Passengers whispered among themselves, speculating about what might have led to her sudden removal. Some defended her, insisting she was probably just doing her job. Others sided with the young man, acknowledging the bias in how he had been treated. Through it all, the young man remained quiet, gripping the armrest tightly. He didn't know exactly what was going on behind the scenes, but he could feel the tension in the air. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the situation had escalated far beyond what anyone expected. And while he hadn't asked for any of this, he couldn't deny the small flicker of hope stirring inside him. Maybe, just maybe, someone was finally listening. The plane sat motionless on the tarmac, its engines silent as passengers exchanged confused glances. The delay dragged on longer than anyone expected, and the tension in the cabin grew thicker with each passing minute. Some people complained loudly about missed connections and wasted time, while others leaned over to their neighbors whispering theories about what might be happening. Everyone seemed restless, but no one more so than the young man at the center of it all. He sat stiffly in his seat, trying to look calm even though his mind was racing. He had a sinking feeling that the entire situation somehow revolved around him. It wasn't hard to guess, after all. He'd sent that message to his uncle not long before things started unraveling. But what exactly was going on? Was this really about him, or was there some other explanation? As the minutes ticked by, ground crew members continued moving in and out of the aircraft. They spoke in hushed tones to the captain, who occasionally made vague announcements over the intercom. "We're working to resolve the issue as quickly as possible," he said at one point, though he offered no details. His words did little to ease the growing frustration among the passengers. Then something unexpected happened. The door to the jet bridge swung open again and a tall figure stepped onto the plane. It was the young man's uncle, the lawyer. Dressed sharply in a suit that commanded respect, he scanned the cabin until his eyes landed on his nephew. Without hesitation, he walked straight toward him, ignoring the curious stares from other travelers. When the uncle reached the seat, he placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. "You all right?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but warm. The young man nodded, though his expression betrayed how overwhelmed he felt. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered back, leaning closer so only his uncle could hear. "I just wanted to tell you what happened." His uncle gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about that right now. Let's focus on fixing this together." There was a quiet strength in his tone, the kind that made the young man feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this anymore. With that, the uncle turned to address the flight crew. He introduced himself briefly, flashing a badge that identified him as an attorney. Then, gesturing toward the young man, he requested a private meeting with airline representatives. The request was granted almost immediately. Clearly, the airline was eager to contain whatever firestorm they sensed brewing. In a small office near the gate, the meeting began. On one side of the table sat the young man and his uncle, both looking composed but determined. Across from them were two airline executives, visibly uneasy as they fidgeted with folders and pens. The room felt tense, like the calm before a storm. The uncle wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. He laid out everything that had happened: the accusation, the public humiliation, the way the young man had been singled out without cause. He presented evidence too: witness statements from passengers who had seen the incident unfold, screenshots of social media posts highlighting the growing outrage online, and even video footage someone had captured on their phone. "This isn't just about my nephew," the uncle said firmly, his voice carrying a weight that demanded attention. "It's about accountability. This kind of behavior has no place in your company, or anywhere else. People deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from." The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them tried to defend the flight attendant, suggesting she may have simply been stressed or misunderstood the situation, but the uncle cut her off mid-sentence. "Stress is no excuse for discrimination," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "And let's be clear, this wasn't a misunderstanding. My nephew followed every rule, yet he was treated like a criminal in front of everyone. That's unacceptable." By the end of the meeting, the airline reps were visibly shaken. They agreed to launch an internal investigation into the flight attendant's conduct and promised to review their training protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. They also offered a formal apology, which the uncle accepted on behalf of his nephew, but only after making it clear that apologies weren't enough. Real change needed to happen. Back on the plane, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Passengers watched as the young man and his uncle returned, their presence commanding a mix of curiosity and admiration. The captain made another announcement, apologizing once again for the delay and thanking everyone for their patience. Then finally, the plane began taxiing toward the runway once more. For the young man, the relief was palpable, but so was the realization that this moment would stay with him forever. He glanced out the window as the plane picked up speed, his thoughts swirling with questions about what came next. Would this incident fade into the background, forgotten by most? Or would it spark real change, not just within the airline, but in the way people treated each other every day? As the wheels left the ground and the cityscape shrank below, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Part of him wished none of this had ever happened, but another part, a stronger part, felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, standing up for himself had been worth it, and maybe, just maybe, others would find the courage to do the same when faced with unfairness. The plane finally took off, climbing higher into the sky as the city below faded into a patchwork of lights. For most passengers, the drama seemed to be over. They turned their attention back to their books, phones, or the in-flight entertainment system, eager to forget the delay and focus on reaching their destinations. But for the young man at the center of it all, the weight of what had happened lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was far from ordinary. It was life-changing. As the flight progressed, whispers continued to ripple through the cabin. Some people glanced his way, their expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy. Others avoided looking at him altogether, perhaps unsure of how to process what they'd witnessed. A few passengers even approached him directly, offering quiet words of support. "You handled that well," one older woman said, with a gentle smile before returning to her seat. Another man nodded in solidarity, saying simply, "Stay strong." These small gestures meant more to the young man than he could put into words. Up until now, he'd felt isolated, like the world was closing in on him. But these moments of kindness reminded him that not everyone saw him through the lens of bias or judgment. There were good people out there, people who cared enough to stand with him, even if only silently. Meanwhile, down on the ground, the story was spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. The uncle's call to the journalist friend proved to be a turning point. Within hours, news outlets picked up the incident, framing it as an example of systemic issues within the airline industry. Headlines blared across social media platforms. Teenager humiliated on flight sparks outcry. Passenger speaks out against discrimination, and airline faces backlash over crew conduct. The hashtags "Yours Fair Treatment for All" and "Stand for Justice" dominated Twitter trends, drawing millions of views and sparking heated debates. Journalists reached out to passengers who had been on the flight, asking for first-hand accounts of what had happened. Many came forward, sharing their perspectives and confirming the young man's version of events. One passenger recounted how the flight attendant's tone had seemed unnecessarily harsh, while another described the palpable discomfort in the cabin during the confrontation. These testimonies painted a clear picture. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a pattern of behavior rooted in bias. But the conversation didn't stop there. People began sharing their own stories of being treated unfairly while traveling. A college student talked about being questioned repeatedly about her ticket, despite having valid ID. A business traveler recounted how he was singled out for additional screening because of his appearance. Each story added fuel to the fire, amplifying calls for change within the aviation industry. Back on the plane, the young man scrolled through his phone, watching as the narrative unfolded in real time. Tweets, articles, and videos flooded his feed, each one highlighting different aspects of the incident. At first, he felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of attention. This wasn't supposed to be about him. He'd only wanted to address what had happened quietly without causing a fuss. But as he read through the comments and messages pouring in from strangers, Something shifted inside him. People weren't just talking about him. They were standing with him. Messages of encouragement poured in from all corners of the globe. Celebrities tweeted their support, calling for accountability and reform. Lawmakers chimed in too, promising to look into policies that allowed such incidents to occur unchecked. Even advocacy groups reached out, inviting him to speak at upcoming events focused on combating discrimination. The young man realized that this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was everyone's. The incident had struck a nerve, shining a spotlight on an issue that affected countless individuals every day. And while he hadn't asked for this role, he couldn't deny the responsibility that came with it. If his experience could help bring about change, then maybe it was worth enduring the pain and embarrassment he'd felt earlier. When the plane landed, the scene outside the terminal was chaotic. Reporters crowded the arrival area, microphones in hand, hoping to catch a glimpse of the young man whose story had captivated the nation. Cameras flashed as he stepped off the jet bridge, flanked by his uncle. For a moment, he froze, unsure of how to navigate the swarm of people, but his uncle placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward. "Just breathe," his uncle whispered. "Take your time." The young man nodded, gathering his courage. As he faced the cameras, he felt a surge of determination. This wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about using his voice to make a difference. He spoke briefly, thanking those who had supported him and emphasizing the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. His words were simple but powerful, resonating deeply with viewers around the world. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "But if my story can help prevent someone else from going through what I did, then it's worth it. We all deserve to feel safe and respected, no matter where we are or who we are." His remarks drew applause from the crowd, both online and offline. Viewers praised his composure and maturity, marveling at how someone so young could handle such a challenging situation with grace. Social media lit up once again, this time with messages of admiration and gratitude. "This kid is going places," one user wrote. "He's got a bright future ahead of him." In the days that followed, the airline scrambled to respond to the backlash. They issued a public apology, acknowledging the harm caused by their employees' actions. They also announced plans to implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff members, vowing to create a safer and more welcoming environment for passengers. While some criticized these measures as insufficient, others saw them as a step in the right direction. For the young man, though, the journey was only beginning. He knew that true change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and persistence. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. Thanks to the support of his uncle, the passengers who stood by him, and the countless strangers who rallied behind him, he felt ready to face whatever came next. As he walked away from the airport that night, surrounded by loved ones, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. This experience had tested him in ways he never imagined, but it had also shown him the power of speaking up and the strength that comes from standing together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was determined to keep fighting for fairness, equality, and justice, not just for himself but for everyone. The days that followed the incident were a whirlwind of emotions and activity for the young man. What started as a personal experience quickly became a national conversation, with people from all walks of life weighing in on what had happened. The airline's apology and promises of reform were just the beginning. For the young man, this was more than an isolated event. It was a chance to spark real change. Media outlets continued to cover the story extensively, highlighting not only his experience but also the broader issues it revealed. Talk shows invited experts to discuss systemic discrimination in public spaces, particularly in industries like aviation, where interactions between staff and passengers happen daily. Social media remained abuzz, with debates raging about accountability, implicit bias, and how to create safer environments for everyone. The young man found himself at the center of it all, thrust into the spotlight whether he wanted to be or not. At first, he struggled with the attention. He wasn't used to being in the public eye, and the constant notifications on his phone felt overwhelming. Messages poured in from strangers, some offering words of encouragement, others sharing their own stories of unfair treatment. It was heartwarming to see so many people standing with him, but it was also exhausting. Every day brought new interviews, requests for statements, and invitations to speak at events. His uncle helped him navigate it all, reminding him to take things one step at a time. "You don't have to do everything at once," his uncle told him during one of their late-night talks. "This is your journey, not theirs. You set the pace." Those words stuck with him. Slowly, he began to embrace his role in the unfolding narrative. Instead of seeing himself as a victim, he started viewing himself as someone who could make a difference. If his voice could shine a light on an issue that affected so many, then maybe all of this was worth it. One of the most impactful moments came when he appeared on a popular morning show. Sitting across from the host, he spoke candidly about what had happened on the plane. He described the humiliation of being singled out, the frustration of not being heard, and the fear of speaking up. But he also talked about the importance of standing firm, even when it feels easier to stay silent. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice calm but full of conviction. "But if my story can help someone else feel less alone, or if it pushes companies to treat people better, then I'm glad it happened. No one should have to go through what I did, or worse, and feel like they can't say anything about it." His honesty resonated deeply with viewers. Calls flooded into the show, with listeners thanking him for speaking out and sharing their own experiences. Some recounted similar incidents on planes, while others talked about facing discrimination in schools, workplaces, or stores. Each story reinforced the idea that this wasn't an isolated problem. It was part of a much larger pattern. The airline, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure to act. While their initial apology and promises of reform were met with skepticism, they eventually took concrete steps to address the criticism. They partnered with civil rights organizations to revamp their training programs, focusing not just on diversity but also on empathy and de-escalation techniques. They created anonymous reporting systems for passengers to share feedback about their experiences, ensuring that concerns wouldn't go unheard. And they publicly committed to holding employees accountable for discriminatory behavior, emphasizing that such actions would no longer be tolerated. Some critics argued that these measures were too little, too late. Others pointed out that true change would require more than policy updates. It would demand a cultural shift within the company. Still, there was no denying that the incident had forced the airline to confront uncomfortable truths about its practices. Whether or not they followed through on their promises remained to be seen, but the fact that they were taking action at all was a step forward. For the young man, the highlight of this period came when he received an invitation to speak at a conference focused on social justice. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of attendees, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. This was uncharted territory for him. He'd never considered himself a public speaker, but he knew his message mattered. As he looked out at the sea of faces, he realized that he wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of how they looked, where they came from, or who they were. "I'm not here to tell you what to think," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I'm here to tell you what I've learned. I've learned that silence doesn't protect us, it only lets bad things continue. I've learned that speaking up isn't easy, but it's necessary. And I've learned that when we stand together, we're stronger than anyone who tries to bring us down." The audience erupted into applause, some people rising to their feet. After the speech, dozens of attendees approached him to thank him for his courage. Many shared their own struggles, telling him how his story inspired them to keep fighting for fairness and equality. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of purpose, a belief that his experience could lead to something meaningful. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Alongside the support came criticism and backlash. Some online trolls accused him of exaggerating the situation, claiming he was seeking attention or financial gain. Others defended the flight attendant, insisting she was simply doing her job. Reading those comments stung, especially after everything he'd been through. But instead of letting them discourage him, he chose to focus on the positive impact his story was having. His uncle reminded him often that hate and negativity always came with the territory when you stood up for something important. You can't control what other people say, his uncle told him. What matters is staying true to yourself and why you started this in the first place. With that mindset, he pressed on. He began working closely with advocacy groups, learning about the history of discrimination and the ongoing fight for equality. He attended workshops, joined panel discussions, and connected with activists who had dedicated their lives to creating a fairer world. Through these experiences, he gained a deeper understanding of the work ahead and the power of collective action. By the time weeks turned into months, the frenzy surrounding the incident began to die down. The headlines faded, and the hashtag stopped trending. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though nothing felt quite the same for the young man. He carried the lessons he'd learned with him everywhere he went, using them to guide his decisions and shape his perspective. One evening, as he sat at home reflecting on everything that had happened, he thought about the future. He didn't know exactly where this path would lead him, but he knew one thing for sure. He wanted to keep making a difference. Whether through law, activism, or another avenue entirely, he was determined to use his voice to advocate for those who couldn't or wouldn't speak up for themselves. As he closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, he smiled softly to himself. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but it was worth traveling. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for the world around him. Months had passed since the incident on the plane, and life for the young man had settled into a new rhythm. The whirlwind of media attention, public appearances, and advocacy work had slowed down, giving him time to reflect on everything he'd been through. While the chaos of those first few weeks was behind him, the impact of his actions lingered, not just in his own life, but in the lives of countless others who had been inspired by his courage. He still thought about that day often, replaying the moments in his mind like scenes from a movie. The flight attendant's sharp words, the stares of fellow passengers, the way his heart had raced as he sent that message to his uncle. It all felt so vivid, even now. But instead of dwelling on the pain or embarrassment, he focused on what came after. He thought about the strangers who reached out to share their stories, the activists who welcomed him into their fold, and the airline's promises to do better. These were reminders that his voice mattered, and that speaking up could spark real change. One afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table scrolling through social media, he stumbled across a post from someone he didn't recognize. It was a photo of a teenager holding a sign that read, "Stand for Justice." Beneath it, the caption read, "Because of you, I'm not afraid to speak up anymore." The young man stared at the screen, his chest tightening with emotion. He realized then how far his story had traveled, how deeply it had resonated with people he'd never met. That moment stayed with him throughout the day. It reminded him why he couldn't let the momentum fade. Even though the headlines had quieted and the hashtags had stopped trending, the issues he'd brought to light were still very much alive. Discrimination didn't disappear overnight, and neither did fear. If anything, his experience taught him that progress required persistence. It wasn't enough to make noise. You had to keep showing up day after day until things began to shift. With that in mind, he decided to take another step forward. Inspired by the activists he'd worked with, he started volunteering at a local community center. There, he mentored young people who faced challenges similar to his own, kids who felt overlooked, misunderstood, or dismissed because of their background. He listened to their stories, offered advice when asked, and encouraged them to believe in themselves. More than anything, he wanted them to know they weren't alone. The kids responded to him in ways he hadn't expected. They looked up to him, not just because of what he'd been through, but because of how he carried himself. He spoke openly about his fears and doubts, admitting that standing up for himself hadn't been easy. Yet he also emphasized the importance of resilience, that sometimes bravery meant doing the hard thing even when you weren't sure it would work out. "You don't have to be perfect," he told them during one session. "You just have to try. And if you fall, you get back up." That's how we move forward." His words struck a chord with the group. One boy, barely 12 years old, approached him afterward. "I want to be like you when I grow up," he said, shyly. The young man smiled, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "You already are," he replied. "You're strong and you care about fairness. That's all it takes." As weeks turned into months, he found himself growing more confident in his ability to make a difference. He began writing articles for online platforms, sharing insights about discrimination, and offering practical advice for handling difficult situations. His pieces were honest and relatable, drawing praise from readers who appreciated his straightforward approach. Some schools even invited him to speak to students, sparking conversations about empathy, respect, and standing up for what's right. But perhaps the most meaningful development came when the airline reached out to him again. This time, it wasn't to apologize. It was to ask for his help. They were launching a new initiative aimed at improving customer service and addressing bias among staff, and they wanted him to serve as an advisor. At first, he hesitated. Could he trust them to follow through? Would this just be another empty gesture? After discussing it with his uncle, he agreed to participate, but only under certain conditions. He insisted on being part of every stage of the process, from designing training modules to reviewing feedback from passengers. He also made it clear that he wouldn't sugarcoat anything. If something wasn't working, he'd say so. To their credit, the airline accepted his terms without hesitation. Working with the airline gave him a fresh perspective. He saw firsthand how complex these issues were, how deeply ingrained biases could be, and how much effort it took to create lasting change. But he also saw glimmers of hope. Employees who attended the training sessions shared heartfelt reflections about what they'd learned. Passengers reported feeling more respected during their travels. Slowly but surely, the culture within the company began to shift. Of course, there were setbacks along the way. Not everyone embraced the changes enthusiastically. Some employees resisted the new policies, while others argued that the reforms were unnecessary. Critics outside the company continued to question whether the airline's efforts were genuine or merely performative. But the young man remained steadfast. He knew perfection wasn't the goal. Progress was. By the end of the year, he found himself boarding another flight. This time, he wasn't nervous. As he walked onto the plane, he noticed the warm smiles of the crew members greeting passengers. They seemed genuinely happy to be there, eager to make everyone feel welcome. When the captain welcomed everyone aboard, he mentioned the airline's commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect, a subtle nod to the changes that had taken place. The young man settled into his seat, gazing out the window as the plane prepared for takeoff. He thought about how far he'd come since that fateful day months ago. Back then, he'd been a teenager traveling alone, unsure of himself and anxious about what lay ahead. Now, he was someone who had faced adversity head-on and emerged stronger for it. As the plane lifted off the ground, climbing higher into the sky, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for his family, who supported him unconditionally. Gratitude for the strangers who stood by him when he needed it most. And gratitude for himself, for finding the courage to speak up when it mattered. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, more voices to amplify and more battles to win. But for now, he allowed himself to feel proud of what he'd accomplished. He had turned a painful experience into an opportunity to inspire others and push for change. And that was something worth celebrating. When the plane landed hours later, he stepped off with a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. Because he knew one simple truth. When you stand up for yourself and others, you plant seeds of hope. And those seeds, no matter how small, have the power to grow into something extraordinary.